Like just about every family, as our kids began to grow up, we were interested in tracking how that was going. The doctor was already checking it and telling us, what percentile they fit in. And so one day at a craft fair somewhere, we ran across one of those charts you would put on the wall. It was made out of wood and had, the measurements going up. And we got that and put that on the wall at home. And we would mark it as the kids were growing with a name and with the date. How many of you have done that growth chart thing? You can get those on Amazon now. They're, all kinds of neat designs in that. We still have that growth chart. That is among our non-replaceable family heirlooms that we have, because we can go back to it and we're reminded that those kids grew up and all those grocery bills were worth it, we hope, as they got bigger. Did the kids care about that chart? Well, you bet they did, right? They were entrenched in the business of growing up, and so they wanted to see how they were progressing at that, and they also compared it to each other. Well, where were you when you were age 5? I'm taller than you were when you were age 5, things like that. Well, they would go back and look at that chart, that stick, just to see how they were doing at growing. So I ask this morning, as we jump into this chapter in the book of Luke, how are you doing at growing, and what is the stick that you look at to measure that? Shouldn't we even be more interested in our spiritual development, especially if our physical selves have stopped growing and now we're just growing out? That's a whole lot less interesting to keep track of. But how are we doing spiritually in growing? What's the chart? What's the standard? What's the canon? That's another word, a measurement, that you use to measure that kind of growth. And the answer that we have looked at for this year is in Ephesians chapter 4. You might remember looking at that a couple of weeks ago, Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 13. Till we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Later on in that passage, it says we're to grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. Paul tells the followers of Jesus Christ that we are supposed to be growing, that we are supposed to, here's the words, level up. That's supposed to be part of the deal. There's a specific standard, he says, to use to measure ourselves so that we can see how we are doing. And what is that? The measure is the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. That sounds like a Sunday school answer. The answer is Jesus, but it's right. So you hold up that measure, Jesus, and you stand yourself next to that measure and see how you're doing. And that's what we're doing in the Gospel of Luke over these weeks that we're in there. We're looking at some of the features in the life of Jesus that show up only in the book of Luke. They are unique to Luke. And we're seeing how we measure up to the Jesus standard. How do I look when I'm standing next to that? If I can look at my heart, or if I can look in and see the heart of Jesus, rather, in the book of Luke, and then I can compare my heart to that, I can ask, how is my heart doing, and get a good answer from Jesus. Amen? So let's go to our Bibles and open up to the book of Luke in chapter 7. If you are using one of the Bibles that's there in the pew, it's on page 811. Luke chapter 7. If you're not using one of those Bibles in the pew, I don't know what page you're in. Look off of someone else's and find it. But Luke chapter 7, we're going to start reading today in verse 11. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. Nain, I know, I spent my whole life calling it Nain. I looked a little more carefully at it, and really the technical pronunciation would be Nain. So if you want to sound scholarly around people, call it Nain. Little village not too far from Jesus' hometown of Galilee. It was located on Hill Moreh. Now, around on the other side of that big hill was what had been Shunem, where 800 years ago, previous to this story, God sent the prophet Elisha to raise from the dead the son of a Shunammite woman. 2 Kings chapter 4. Today, the village of Nain looks kind of like that. You can see the hill there in the background. So Jesus and a large entourage of interested people are approaching this out-of-the-way village. It's mentioned nowhere else in the Bible except right here in Luke chapter 7. And this day, there is, coming from the city, the funeral of a young man. Funerals usually happened on the same day that somebody died. And as was the custom, there would be a procession led first by the women, and in this case, the mother of this young man. And then a funeral bier, a litter, probably carried by 4 men up on their shoulders, an open kind of stretcher thing like you see in Middle Eastern funerals today sometimes in the news. It was also customary for people, as that procession came by, to drop what they were doing and join into the procession out of respect and care. That procession has made its way all the way out of town as Jesus reaches it. And rather than just fall into line with the procession like a good Jew would do, Jesus made a breach of Jewish custom. He approached the mother and spoke to her. And then it says he touched the funeral bier. Interrupting a funeral was one thing. That was already out of line. But any contact with a corpse was another thing. That would have made Jesus unclean, ceremonially unclean. Any kind of contact with a dead body would make you unclean for a week. And the influence of that contact with death would rub off onto the people who made contact with it. But in Jesus' case, note this, the influence of that contact goes the other direction. When all is said and done, no one's going to be able to look at Jesus and say, "Well, you're unclean for a week." Why? Well, because you touched that body. Really? You mean the guy over here standing and walking around and talking? So here's one question to ask when we stand ourselves next to the measure of Jesus and asking how we look compared to that standard. Here's a question to ask. Am I willing to step into the world and be regarded as soiled for the sake of those who need help? James chapter 1 ends with James saying that religion that is pure and undefiled in the sight of God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Well, Jesus was showing religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father. You know what? I want a heart like that. How about you? I'm in Haiti. We're hanging out at a church building that is under construction there in Gonaives, and we've got an hour or so in the middle of the day to kill. It's daytime, it's hot. There are several kids, probably about a dozen kids, running around the church building, just doing what kids do. And in the midst of all these kids running around and playing, there's this little girl, somewhere between 1 to 2 years old, just a little toddler. Her siblings were supposed to be watching her. They're a little bit looser about taking care of kids. And she is wearing not much more than just a cloth diaper. And all of a sudden, she notices, and I noticed as she came running at me, she's soaked. I mean, she's soaked. She's not just wet, she's soaked. And she's panicked too. Panicked to the point where, to me, a total stranger, she's crying and she's holding out her arms, coming to me. What would you do in the situation of a totally soaked little girl that you didn't know at all? Well, I just walked off. Of course you don't do that. It's kind of messy, it was kind of uncomfortable, but I reached down and I picked up this little girl and I sat her on my lap for quite a while I waited for a parent to show up. And that's what you do for little toddlers who are alone and scared, don't you? Regardless of getting a little messy. Even I know that. And in just a small way, it reminds me that you and I need to be willing to get a bit messy sometimes to help people who really need it. Jude, verse 22, Jude says, "Have mercy on those who doubt. Save others by snatching them out of the fire. To others, show mercy with fear, hating even the garment stained by the flesh." You know, when Jude writes that, he's not talking about diapers. He's talking about people who are soaked in doubt that's pushing them around. He's talking about other people who are caught up in sin, who are all but in the fire right now. And he's talking about angry people and mean people, people who are dependent and needy, selfish people, damaged people with messed up homes, messed up marriages, undeserving people. What do you do for people like that? They're the ones, he says, who need to be snatched out of the fire before it's too late. There are even some people where it's going to be so messy that you have to, he says, show mercy with fear so that you're not dragged into their mess. Once in a while, I'll go to visit someone in the hospital and there's a risk of infection. Have you ever gone to visit somebody and there was a risk of infection, and so the nurse stops you outside the door and says, well, before you can go in, you've got to put on this. Okay, so here you go. And you put on this gown and it has to be tied up, and then you might need to put on those booty things, and you have to put on the gloves and a mask. And by the time you've got all of that on and you go in to visit somebody, they can't even recognize who you are. But there you are. So you get stopped outside their room. You're going to visit this person that you care about, but you've got to put on all this garb if you're going to see them. What do? Turn around and leave? I'm not going to put all that on. No. You put it on and you go in, and sure, it takes some extra effort, some extra measure to make sure that you don't get staph or pneumonia or COVID or MRSA or whatever else there is. I expect that there are some people who are needing to be snatched from the fire, who are going to require some extra effort, who are going to require some measures that you have to take to make sure that you don't get what they have. You hear what I'm saying? Their addiction, their attitude, their mess. And it might take things like having a wingman with you. It may mean that you need to meet in some kind of public place. It may take some extra study and preparation on your part. Maybe it'll take some risks of being misunderstood by what people will think and say. Either way, what does Jude say to do for people who need it? Show them mercy. You know, by being born into this world, Jesus made a huge journey downward. He inserted himself into a completely different set of circumstances. That was a big trip. Didn't take very many more steps for him to step into and pause a funeral procession. And when Jesus came into contact that typically would have influenced him to be declared unclean, Jesus made the influence go the other direction. And that, brothers and sisters, is the standard I think we need to follow. Jesus went completely outside the norms for the sake of helping where it's needed. How do you measure up to that? Here's the second question I think this story should have us asking to see how we're doing at this. It's the question, does compassion go out from me? Does compassion go out from me? My wife is home today, still recovering from knee surgery. She is watching us live online right now. And she's going, is he really going to talk about this? And yes, honey, I am. Sometimes God has a way of making me listen to what I am saying in a sermon. In fact, all the time, but sometimes especially. And this is one of those times, because I can tell you this morning, for every toddler in Haiti where I did it right, there's probably 10 times where I messed it up. Compassion, think about this, is not a simple thing. If you're thinking ahead, it's not simple. It turns up 3 times in Luke, this word does. It turns up in this story describing Jesus. Compassion went out from him for her. The other place it turns up in Luke are 2 stories that Jesus told. One of those is in chapter 10, where he tells the story of a Samaritan who comes across a Jew on the road to Jericho who has been beaten and left for dead on the road. And Jesus said he felt compassion for him, for that man, and he helped him. It wasn't his problem. In fact, it was a well-established racial divide that separated them, but Jesus said he had compassion on him and he helped him. And then there's another story that he tells in Luke chapter 15, and it is the story of a compassionate father. Compassion is what moves the father to welcome back his very disappointing, very undeserving prodigal son, a boy who had made his own mess. You could say he deserved the mess, but the father in that story, Jesus says, had compassion on his son. Those are both good pictures of compassion that Jesus paints for us to consider. Well, look at Luke's description again in chapter 7. Luke's description of the situation, verse 12. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Luke gives us a few details. The crowd is considerable, it's translated, meaning it's a big crowd, probably an indicator of the degree of the tragedy of the whole mess that's walking out of the city that day. It says he was the only son of his mother. That's already very sad, isn't it? And then Luke adds, and she was a widow. You see, sometime previous, there had been another funeral procession. And this same lady had been walking in that procession. And the body that was on the funeral bier was her husband. She'd been through this twice now. Today it's her only son, and that means that this lady's source of support and protection for the future is gone. Her loneliness, the degree of her loneliness, is just one of the problems that she's going to be facing. Without a close family member, her future was destined to be that of a beggar. It's no wonder a considerable crowd is walking with her outside to the place of burial. It is a sad day in Nain. It's a hopeless situation. Jesus, it says, sees her. Jesus sees her. And knowing what she's facing, it says he had compassion on her. You know, the word there is one of my favorites. I've mentioned it a few times before. It's the word splanknon. Go ahead, say it. Splanknon. That is the Greek word for the noble organs. That's it, the noble organs. It describes that inside wrenching of your gut that happens when you're experiencing your deepest emotions. And it says about Jesus here, he saw this widow faced now with two great tragedies that a first century woman could face, and he pitied her deep inside, and he felt it. Anytime we come near a person in a difficult situation, we've got some decisions to make, don't we? For instance, when someone has died, which has happened in our church family now several times in the last few weeks, what do? I think that as a whole, Central Christian Church, let me tell you this, I think we as a whole generally do a good job with this. I think we generally and genuinely take care of people who are going through the grief of losing a loved one. But I can tell you that in my experience over 50 years, that people act in different ways in different places. They know that you're grieving. They're not sure what to say, so they run the other way. Or maybe they try to talk like nothing bad has happened and avoid it. Go back to Jude for just a second. When you see someone is headed to hell for eternity, let me ask you, does that reach inside of you and cause a stir? Does it turn your stomach? What do you do with that? You see, compassion, real compassion, is not comfortable. And if being comfortable is your priority, then you're probably not very good at compassion. Compassion requires you to get close to difficult situations. It also tends to be needed at times that aren't convenient, and it can take time. For it to be real, you might be setting yourself up for some expense down the road, some kind of cost. Remember the Good Samaritan? He had to stop his journey. He had to care for a man who was badly wounded. He took him to an inn. He paid for his expenses and said to the innkeeper, "If there's any more, I'll pay for that too." Jesus saw a woman in great need. She didn't even know Jesus, as far as we know. But compassion went out from him. I want a heart like that, I think. It's kind of scary to say that. My wife is going to hold me to it. But that is the standard of measure in Jesus Christ. How do you measure up to that? Stand next to that. Here's the third question I think this story points out very well. And it's different than the first two. The question is, do I bring hope into otherwise hopeless situations? Philosophers of the past often tried to help grieving people by saying something like, don't grieve because grief doesn't do any good. That was the philosophical approach. Our culture, I think, generally tries to quiet the bereaved by saying, don't cry. Let's think about something else. Let's pretend it didn't happen. Let's just move on in life. And you know what they're saying inside when they say that? Inside, they're saying, I don't want you to cry because it makes me feel uncomfortable. That's not what Jesus was saying when he approached this grieving widow and mother and said to her, stop crying. Now, this is one of those examples where we can't meet the measure of the fullness of Jesus. We won't be very helpful, I can tell you this, by approaching a grieving mother and saying to her, stop crying. But 2 times, Jesus says this to grieving parents. He says it here, and he says it again to Jairus and his wife when their daughter had died. Stop crying. But those weren't empty words, because Jesus brings hope into a funeral procession that turns it into a party. Only Jesus can say, don't weep, because only Jesus removes what causes our weeping. He could say, don't cry with authority, because he has power over death. He has authority to reverse it. We can't speak with that same authority. Listen, if you're not convinced yet, if you're not yet a follower of Jesus, if you haven't sealed that deal yet, would you please pay attention to this morning? Only Jesus can give an order to a dead body and expect him to respond. This idea of bearing hope into situations where it is needed isn't completely foreign to us, though. Paul says in 2 Corinthians that we are Christ's ambassadors. In the book of Galatians, he uses the word messengers. On behalf of God, his disciples are outfitted to bring the news of hope into hopeless scenes on planet Earth. That's you and me. We can do that. Anyone who has their hope in Jesus Christ, by the way, is qualified to do this. Brothers and sisters, we have more than blithe, empty words that really don't help anyone. John chapter 11, Jesus shows up at the house where his friend Lazarus has died. He says to Martha, Lazarus' sister, your brother will live again. And in the case of people who have known and sold out to Jesus, guess what? We get to say that. We get to say that. Your wife will live again. Your husband will live again. Your child will live again. When faith in Jesus Christ is at play. For those same people, for followers of Jesus, no matter what they're facing, we can say to them, you don't have to fear your own death. It's not just some glib cliche that we blab out and some blind grab for hope to say something that might matter. It is a reminder of what we really have, because Jesus promised anyone who has this hope in Jesus Christ is qualified to do this. And for people who aren't following Jesus yet, listen, it is hopeful, a hopeful word that we can tell them, because they can change their situation as long as there's time. Even their worst enemy can cease to be a threat with Jesus' help. You don't have to fear your own death. For the people that we encounter who are hurting or who are lonely, we can tell them with confidence, you're not alone. We can bring that into their situation. It's true. I can tell you they're not alone, because if you're talking to them, they're not alone, right? But they also don't need to be alone as though God were not there to help them. Jesus promises never to leave us, never to forsake us. Those are not empty words. Those are words of hope that we bring into people's hopeless situations. Anyone who has their hope in Jesus Christ is qualified to do this. Look at verse 13. Luke refers to Jesus here as Lord in this situation. Master, over the worst that life can dish out. Jesus gave the command. He sat up, and to remove any doubt about what was going on, Luke says, he began speaking. Now, I thought about this. What do you say when you've just been brought back from the dead? Mom, you were right. I shouldn't have tried to outrun the neighbor's bull. Maybe I shouldn't have eaten that leftover falafel from last week. I don't know. But for a short and painful time, this young man had stopped belonging to his mother. He belonged to death. Death had claimed another, but in verse 15, in a very tender way to express it, Luke says, Jesus gave him to his mother. Jesus delivered hope to a hopeless situation. In a way, that's different. Being like Jesus means we bring hope where it's needed, though. Now, this third question, this third thing, bringing hope, happens only if we have the first two correct. Do you see it? If we're going to bring hope into hopelessness, we've got to be willing, first of all, to step into hopeless situations, don't we? Not run away from them. And we need to be willing to say things that may not seem to make sense to people who don't understand. It will be awkward sometimes. It will almost never be comfortable. And I'll bet you sometimes we will be misunderstood and maybe even slandered. Is it worth it? We're going to need to be moved by something strong. We'll need to be moved by compassion. Splanknon. Bowels of mercy, as King James puts it. Genuine compassion has to go out from God's people to people who genuinely need it. When that's the vehicle behind our words and actions, that's the situation when we can bring real hope where it's needed. I know. I want to have a heart like that. Verses 16 and 17, Luke tells us about the crowd's response to all of this. They are scared and they are praising God. And they are making some conclusions about this man who has just resuscitated a dead person. God has come to live among his people. Amen to that. His name is Jesus. When you hear or see something that can't be explained any other way, it ought to move you to some actions. Most simply put, if Jesus is who he claimed to be, then Jesus deserves to be Lord of our lives also.